In 2019, Spanish developer Game Kitchen, the same team that made the Last Door series, released Blasphemous, an appropriately named Metroidvania with grotesque and beautiful visuals and a bleak, vague storyline that left more than a few people scratching their heads. It's not that it was difficult to see where most of the game's major influences came from. With a cursory glance, it appears to be something along the lines of Catholic Guilt Simulator 2019. But actually sitting down and playing the game opened up a lot of questions, along with a rich, mythological take on the Catholic Church that goes deeper than you'd expect, even from a game that includes jewel-covered saints' corpses and self-flagellating executioners. In Blasphemous, you play the mysterious Penitent One, a figure who travels throughout the land of Custodia, a world warped and twisted by an event known as the Grievous Miracle. You carry a sword that is said to be constructed out of guilt and must end the pain of the many people consumed by the miracle, an omniscient force that curses with horrifying burdens. As you engage in a violent, blood-soaked pilgrimage from one corner of Custodia to the next, you make your way to your final act of penance, hopefully one that will end the cycle of pain. Or something. The in-game mythology of Blasphemous has the same murky style that requires a lot of digging and maybe even a full wall dedicated to how one thing runs into the other, similar to what we've seen in franchises like Dark Souls and Kingdom Hearts. To unpeel that onion requires someone with a level of patience that I can't even pretend to fake. But there is something familiar about the symbolism in this game, isn't there? And as I played through to the end of Blasphemous, I couldn't help but notice certain parallels in the aesthetic and the story that I think have direct correlations not only to the Church, but with a specific moment in its history. What I want to do with this video is pick apart the symbolism of the game itself and investigate what it means to the real world. Essentially, I want to answer this question: what is Blasphemous about, really? I think I have an idea, and in order to explain it fully, we've got to take a step back. A 600-year step back. How much power the Catholic Church actually has depends mostly on where you live, who you ask, and what time period it is, but its controversies have been there for centuries at least. The secrecy that surrounds the societies birthed in the Vatican is like a warm, addictive sludge for conspiracy theories. Everything from the Holy See's cover-up of the lineage of Christ to the Jesuits' involvement in sinking the Titanic, and that's to say nothing about the Knights of Templar, which, no, we are not touching that one. In the world of Blasphemous, our representation of God himself appears to be the Grievous Miracle. The miracle exists as both an entity and an event. It bestows dubious blessings upon the people of Custodia, which usually manifest themselves in monstrous shape-shifting, a life of pain, or worse. The miracle's will is undeniable, and the world it rules over both fears and loves it. It's a pretty sharp observation from the game designers that the idea of a miracle isn't necessarily a positive thing. Whether their visitation by the miracle is a blessing or a curse, no one escapes from it without some level of pain or a test of faith. Beneath the eyes of the miracle is the Twisted One, a major figure of worship in Custodia. In his life, the Twisted One was a man so overcome with guilt that he sat on a log asking constantly to be punished. What this guilt was about is never discussed. Eventually, the miracle causes the tree to wrap around and kill the Twisted One. This story involves the first person to be inflicted with the miracle, and the parallel between this figure and Christ is, well, it's pretty clear. Now, perhaps the most famous arm of the Catholic Church was the Spanish Inquisition. Founded in the 15th century by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, the Inquisition was dedicated to maintaining and growing the Catholic Church within the Iberian Peninsula and rooting out anything that they saw as heretical or blasphemous. You see, at that point in Iberian history, the peninsula was a pretty cosmopolitan spot. Like most of Europe in the Middle Ages, the various regions of Spain and Portugal had been conquered and populated by wildly different cultures over the course of centuries, to include Germanic tribes like the Vandals and the Visigoths, French Celts, and Muslims from the Middle East and North Africa. And as a result, the populations of the various Spanish kingdoms were a blending of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish people. By the time the Inquisition was established, the Reconquista, a series of wars meant to push the Muslim conquerors out of southern Spain, had been going on for centuries, and the kingdoms of Spain were, politically at least, Christian-led. So if the Reconquista was meant to conquer the land for the church, the Inquisition was meant to conquer the people. And while initially non-Christians were subjected to a similar "you picked the wrong religion" tax that the Muslim communities enforced on non-Muslims, it didn't take long for the Grand Inquisitor Torquemada and the Spanish Inquisition to lead the charge in a peninsula-wide convert-or-die direction. Practicing Jews and Muslims alike were forced to get cozy with a baptism, leave, or be executed. While this was happening to non-Christians, the common Catholics of the Spanish kingdoms weren't exactly getting off light themselves. The Inquisition thrived on fear and paranoia.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Our chief weapon is surprise. Surprise and fear. Fear and surprise. Our two weapons are fear and surprise and ruthless efficiency. Our three weapons are fear and surprise and ruthless efficiency and an almost fanatical devotion to the Pope.
And the notion that you or someone you knew was committing heresy or blaspheming or skipping out on your tithing was an idea that apparently infuriated and obsessed your local archbishop. And in order to keep the people in line, they used two of the most time-tested methods in history: guilt and violence. The martyrdom of Jesus Christ is essentially one of the best tools in existence for the former. He died for your sins, after all. That's gotta be worth a few lousy bucks in the collection plate. You don't want to seem ungrateful, do you? This is essentially an extreme version of your mom guilting you into writing a letter to your aunt to thank her for the $5 she sent you on your birthday, even though you thanked her when she came over for dinner last week. Make it sound sincere, make it public, make it showy, and put on a tie, for God's sakes. We don't want people to think we dress you like a hobo. This is an attitude that works in and outside of the church. A real feeling of guilt and a desire to be absolved of said guilt is a powerful motivator to turn in friends, family, and anyone else in exchange for a nice pat on the head, even if those you've ratted out aren't guilty of anything that you know of. In Blasphemous, we see this accumulation of guilt in a mechanical sense. Your guilt increases when you're killed, and is represented through a vine of thorns that shorten the fervor bar, which essentially acts as a mana bar. The more guilt you have, the less of your gifts you're able to use in a fight. And the main way of getting rid of this guilt is finding a confessor statue, where you can presumably confess your sins and feel fully absolved right up until you get killed by another boss battle. You know, just like in real life. That same level of divine guilt is physically represented by the penitent one's weapon, the sword mea culpa. Mea culpa literally translates to "my guilt" or "I apologize." This is the phrase that is said to be spoken by the flagellants who whip themselves to atone for their sin. So the clear meaning is that this sharpened tool of your sin is to be used to end the suffering of miracle-stricken denizens of Custodia. Your entire existence in Blasphemous isn't all that different from the lives of Spanish citizens in the medieval era. Guilt and suffering and penance until the day you die. This 1-2 punch of guilt and penance led to events like the auto de fe.
The Inquisition, what a show. The Inquisition, here we go. We know you're wishing that we go away, but the Inquisition's here and it's here too. Hey, Torquemada, what do you say? I just got back from the auto de fe. Auto de fe? What's an auto de fe? It's what you oughtn't to do, but you do anyway.
Well, sort of. An auto de fe was a ritualistic public act of contrition. The idea was that people who had committed crimes against God and the Church were meant to gather in public to atone for their sins. This could range from specific crimes like bigamy and sodomy to the more vague and convenient accusations of heresy, like the good old-fashioned following the wrong God rule. The punishment often involved some level of humiliation and torture, but generally climaxed with the sentencing of various heretics followed by their public execution. But these events were less about the assuagement of guilt and a desire to glorify God, and more about power. A population that saw these brutal punishments as ubiquitous knew to keep its collective mouths shut. For the most part, anyway. These events continued for as long as the Inquisition did, though the last one wasn't in the Iberian Peninsula. It was in Mexico. But more on that later. That guilt also led many to voluntarily humiliate and punish themselves. On holy days, crowds of sinners would gather in parades to flagellate themselves in order to atone. Using whips and other implements, these penitents aimed to cleanse their souls by imitating one form of the punishment that was visited upon Christ on the day of his crucifixion. The tradition actually continues to this day, with some cultures even going so far as to actually crucify themselves, though rarely to the point of death.
The caped and hooded figures of devoted penitents surround the floats. These are an icon of Semana Santa celebrations. Unfortunately, for most Americans, these masked figures evoke the Ku Klux Klan. But these outfits predate the racist KKK by centuries.
And this is where the overall look and theme of the Penitent One comes from. That headgear is called a San Benito, and is combined with the metal masks seen in artwork that portray self-flagellants. The mask was used to hide their identities, while the conical shape of the hat was meant to distract from the person looking for penance. The shape pointed skyward, as a reminder to any watchers who this person was atoning to, God on high. In addition, the designers at Game Kitchen added a crown of thorns to further accentuate the Christ parallel atonement. And while Christ is never mentioned by name in Custodia, thorns themselves are a common enough symbol of self-sacrifice and atonement in Blasphemous. Now, there are a lot of other symbols present in Blasphemous that do a great job of representing the strength of the Spanish Inquisition. Everything from cherubs to cathedrals made of bone to villains that strike the poses of some of the church's most famous works of art. But we're not just talking about Catholic symbology here. And in order to get to the heart of what I think this game represents, we're going to have to dig a little deeper than just the Inquisition in Spain. We need to look further afield. Because despite the name Spanish Inquisition, all this violence, guilt, and persecution was not contained solely within the Iberian Peninsula. Across the Atlantic, the Inquisition was alive and well, particularly in the colonies of Spain. Mere decades after the founding of the Inquisition, the Spanish were spreading their territory and their religion in what would become modern-day Mexico. The ancient cultures of the Mexica and Aztecs had existed there for millennia, but over the course of a handful of years, the Spanish destroyed their empires through a combination of treachery, disease, and superior firepower. Renaming the country New Spain, Inquisitor Cortes and his army colonized the area and began to systematically ransack it for its natural resources, including an absolute dragon's hoard of gold, which they would begin melting down and sending back to Spain in fleets and elaborate trading routes that would help line the pockets of Europeans for over 200 years. It wasn't long before a new wing of the Inquisition would find its way to the supposed New World. After all, the Spanish were facing an entire civilization that knew nothing about the Catholic Church. Now that the Spanish had the physical subservience of the indigenous people of the Americas, they would begin to work on their souls. This moment in time must have looked insane to the Mexica and the Aztecs, Spanish conquistadors bearing the symbol of a tortured man who was also a god. It's not a great introduction to the faith. Of course, all religions seem pretty insane from the outside. The Aztecs had a god that gave agriculture to the world with the act of flaying the skin from his own body. More on him later. We can see the symbolism of this time period in the Spanish colonies constantly throughout Blasphemous. Perhaps the most important and obvious parallel comes from the appearance of gold in the game. From the floating heads of holy guardians to the golden wounds of the Twisted One and Our Lady of the Charred Visage, molten gold plays a big part in the way many of the most powerful characters in Blasphemous appear. But why? One explanation might come from a truly brutal punishment that was visited upon Aztecs and Spanish alike, having molten gold poured down their throats. And horrifying execution is just one of the handy uses for gold. The Spanish used it not only to glorify themselves and their station, but also their god, and much of the gold sent back to Spain in the 16th century was used as a way to fund the Inquisition. So it would stand to reason that holy figures and saints within the Catholic-inspired world of Blasphemous would be covered in gold, even bleeding the stuff. This is especially obvious with bosses like Melquiades, the gigantic corpse of an archbishop who is completely covered in gold finery. And while gold is an important part of most video games, in most situations, those games are using it as a currency, the same way the rest of the world has for thousands of years. Not so in Blasphemous. Instead, gold is apparently only to be possessed by the most powerful within its world. It absolutely drips from the otherworldly beings that the Penitent One aims to please. Instead of buying upgrades with some sort of precious material, the Penitent One is rewarded with the dubious currency of atonement, meaning your sacrifice, your blood, your sweat, and your efforts are not in the service of bringing yourself from a neutral standpoint to a greater lot in life, but a fumbling, scrambling crawl out of a pit of damnation that you began in. Anyone familiar with the notion of original sin knows exactly what I'm talking about here. Perhaps the most obvious aspect of Blasphemous that illustrates this is the Order of the True Shrine Church in the city of Albero. The church begins empty and unadorned, with a place to collect alms in the form of atonement that you've collected. If instead of using that atonement to upgrade your abilities, you want to donate it to the church regularly, you'll start to notice a shift. The walls slowly become adorned with gold, jewels, and precious works of art, and more worshippers begin to arrive. That gold is not your gold, and it never will be. One interesting idea that supports this comes from the confessor statues. Initially, they act as a way to remove guilt in exchange for more atonement points, but eventually, the Penitent One learns to destroy these statues, and in the room behind them is a new statue, covered in molten gold, almost as if the priests who absolve you of your sins are being used to hide the wealth of the church and the crimes they committed to attain it. So the message is clear. Precious materials like gold are not for the common person. They're meant for the powers that be, both mortal and otherwise. For you, me, the Penitent One, there is only atonement to be had in the face of certain damnation. And this goes double for the indigenous people, who are both damned and slaughtered for their wealth. This brings me back to the theme in Blasphemous of miracles themselves. The fascinating thing about these miracles is the idea that they're not really something you'd want. They're not positive in the traditional sense. Miracles are pain and suffering in Custodia. Each and every twisted creature you defeat in Blasphemous is suffering from the grievous miracle, and destroying them makes for a haunting parallel with the Aztecs and Mexica being slaughtered for the supposed miracle of their gold. By the late 1500s, the Spanish Inquisition was firmly established in Mexico. So based on what we've seen with how they treat Muslims and Jews in Europe, we could assume that they'd put a similar smackdown on the pagan religions of the native populace, right? Well, we could, but that isn't what really happened. Interestingly enough, the Inquisition recognized that the Catholic Church and the native pantheon had some real similarities, including the parallel of certain gods with Catholic saints. And both religions have a heavy use of the symbolic drinking of blood, though the Aztecs did that particular ritual, they took it a little further than your local mass might. Now, that's not to suggest that the Church had a new live and let live attitude to the religions of Mesoamerica. Quite the contrary. They fully intended to see to it that the local populace would all eventually practice Christianity. They just happened to believe that the paganism practiced there was a genuine expression of Christianity that had been corrupted by demonic influence. So they went with a strategy that the Church has always used when it came to pagans. Find the similarities and shift their focus to your team. You're not worshipping Brigid, the Gaelic goddess of poetry, healing, and smithing. You're revering Saint Brigid of Kildare. That isn't the mother goddess Tonantzin. You're talking to the Virgin Mary. Obviously. And if after all that logic you still didn't kneel before the cross, then the Church would destroy you and your family entirely. This blending of two theologies is seen very clearly in the characters of Blasphemous. Most of them have some sort of Catholic theme to them on the surface. Ten Piedad is a terrific example. When you first meet him, he is draped in the arms of a Madonna-like figure in a pose directly lifted from Michelangelo's Pietà. The form of Jesus, however, is warped and translated into something less familiar. He has a goat's head similar to that of Baphomet, a traditional figure revered in pagan and occult circles. In addition, Ten Piedad is supported by the forces of nature. This lines up with the idea of fighting back the jungle, the wild places. It's an attitude that's existed in colonization basically since its inception. Because ultimately what the Church wants is not a blending of two equal theologies. What it wants is to absorb the native faith into itself, a spiritual annexation. And that makes all the difference when you look at the patterns and symbolism rife within this game. If you play Blasphemous with the right set of historical eyes, it becomes a metaphor for Spain and the Inquisition's destruction of the religious beliefs of the indigenous populace of Central and South America. And as a final piece to the puzzle, let's get back to those gods again. Remember before when I mentioned the Aztecs' flayed god? His name is Xipa Totec, and he's the god of agriculture, vegetation, and wouldn't you know it, goldsmiths. He's commonly represented with peeled back, flayed skin, another parallel with Catholicism. By the time the Spanish first arrived in Mesoamerica, Xipa Totec was commonly worshipped, and who, ultimately, is the penitent one sent to defeat for the good of Custodia and its people? Escribar, a figure encased at first in the familiar trappings of Catholicism, but as he shifts into his true form, he reveals himself to be a figure in red, almost as if his skin has been torn from his body. And though he ultimately gained his power from the miracle, just as the Inquisition believed the Aztec gods were warped shadows of Christian figures, the message becomes clear. Ultimately, there's only room for one god on the block. Custodia, when translated from Latin, means imprisonment, and like all of those in Custodia afflicted with the miracle, in defeating Escribar, you're setting them free, allowing them atonement and rest, much in the same way that the Inquisition saw penitents and the victims of the auto da fe, the same freedom that the penitent one desires. A figure whose greatest weapon, guilt, is also his greatest burden. Something that no one in real life knows anything about. Am I right? Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm not entirely sure how much of this lines up with your own interpretation of Blasphemous, but it's certainly what was swirling around in my head while I was playing. How does it line up with your own theories? Let me know in the comments. I don't make a ton of videos these days. I make them pretty much exactly when I feel like it, which means it's a true roll of the dice, to be honest. But if you're looking for more material from me, I'd kindly ask that you subscribe to my podcast Pixel Lit. It's a show where me and Kevin the Arcadeologist read through and discuss various novelizations of video games. We've gone through everything from Resident Evil to Halo to Diablo, and we come out with a new episode every week. You can find us wherever you get podcasts. Thanks again for watching. Consider subscribing to my channel here if you want to be notified of the next time I put thoughts into video form. I'd promise that it'll be before the next Winter Olympics, but who are we kidding here? It'll happen when it happens. See you next time.